The moment the bank said my account was frozen, I realized my wife had already made her move. I remember standing there in that polished marble lobby, debit card still in my hand, the faint hum of the air conditioning brushing against my skin like nothing had changed, like my life hadn't just been quietly interrupted by a single line of red text on a screen. Transaction declined? Account restricted. It didn't make sense at first. I had more than enough in that account. I knew the numbers. I built those numbers from nothing. I tried again, slower this time, like maybe the machine needed patience instead of logic, but the result didn't change. Declined? Restricted? Frozen? The word sat there heavier than it should have, like it carried a meaning the system wasn't explaining. I stepped aside, letting the next person in line move forward, pretending this was a small inconvenience instead of something else entirely. My phone buzzed in my pocket before I even reached the glass doors. A number I didn't recognize. I answered anyway. Mr. Carter? The voice was calm, professional, practiced. This is a courtesy call to inform you that a request has been filed to freeze all financial accounts under your name pending further legal review. There was a pause, just long enough for the words to settle into something real. The request was submitted this morning. I didn't need to ask who filed it. There are moments in life when the answer arrives before the question forms. Olivia. My wife. The same woman who kissed me goodbye 2 nights ago like everything was still normal. The same woman who sat across from me at dinner, smiling, asking about my day, her voice steady, her eyes warm. Looking back, I realized that's the part that should have warned me. It was too steady. Too controlled. Like she had already made peace with something I hadn't even seen coming. I walked out into the parking lot, the Texas sun hitting harder than usual, heat rising off the asphalt in slow waves. My truck sat where I left it, quiet, reliable, unchanged. I leaned against the door for a second, letting the silence stretch out around me. Funny thing is, I wasn't angry. Not yet. Anger comes fast when you don't understand what's happening. But I understood enough. This wasn't impulsive. This wasn't a fight that got out of hand. This was planned. Carefully. Quietly. And probably for longer than I wanted to admit. Olivia had always been sharp. That's what drew me to her in the beginning. She noticed details other people missed. She asked questions that made you feel like she was always one step ahead of the room. Back then I thought that meant we were building something strong together. Lately, I'd started to notice a different kind of question. Not about how my day went. Not about how I was feeling. Numbers. Accounts. Structures. How are things organized now? She asked one night while scrolling through her phone like it was casual. Everything still under your name? I remember shrugging it off, answering without thinking too much about it. That's what you do when you trust someone. You don't interrogate curiosity. You don't look for angles in someone you love. But standing there in that parking lot, with my account locked and a legal notice hanging in the air like a storm that hadn't fully broken yet, I could see the pattern forming in reverse. Each question. Each quiet moment. Each time she watched me instead of listening. It wasn't concern. It was calculation. My phone buzzed again. This time it was her name lighting up the screen. Olivia. I let it ring once. Twice. 3 times. Then I answered. Daniel, she said, her voice soft, almost careful. We need to talk. I leaned my head back against the truck, eyes half closed, letting out a slow breath that didn't feel like relief. I think you already started that conversation, I said calmly. There was a brief silence on the other end, just enough to confirm what I already knew. She hadn't expected me to find out this quickly. It's not what you think, she said. That line. It always sounds the same, no matter who says it. I glanced back at the bank through the glass doors, people moving in and out like nothing had shifted. You tried to freeze my accounts, I replied, my voice steady even. That's exactly what I think. Another pause. Longer this time. I could almost hear her recalibrating, adjusting the story she planned to tell. And that's when it hit me. Not the betrayal. Not even the strategy behind it. But the assumption. She thought this would work. She thought she could lock me out of my own life with a signature and a court filing. I opened my eyes, staring out at the stretch of highway beyond the parking lot, sunlight reflecting off passing cars in brief flashes. "Olivia," I said quietly, almost like I was reminding her of something simple, something obvious. "You should have checked one thing before you made that move." Her voice tightened, just slightly. "What are you talking about?" I pushed myself off the truck, standing a little straighter now, the weight of the moment settling into something clear, something controlled. "Those accounts," I said, letting the words land without rushing them, "aren't in my name anymore." I could hear it in her breathing before she said a single word, that slight pause where confidence turns into calculation, the moment someone realizes the script they wrote is no longer being followed, and for the first time since I had known Olivia, she did not sound like the smartest person in the room, she sounded like someone trying to catch up. "What do you mean they are not in your name anymore?" she asked, slower now, careful, like each word needed to be measured before it left her mouth. And I almost smiled, not because it was funny, but because it confirmed something I had been quietly preparing for long before this phone call ever happened, long before she ever thought about filing anything against me. "I mean exactly what I said," I replied, my voice steady, almost conversational, like we were discussing something as ordinary as the weather. "Those accounts you tried to freeze do not belong to me anymore." And that was the part that mattered, not the money itself, not the numbers sitting behind passwords and statements, but the ownership, the structure, the part most people ignore because it sounds boring until it suddenly becomes everything. There was silence again, but this time it was heavier, longer, filled with something that had not been there before, doubt. I pushed off from the truck and started walking across the parking lot, each step slow, controlled, like I had nowhere else to be, because in that moment I did not. I had already stepped out of the situation she was trying to trap me in. I just had not told her yet. "You moved them," she said finally, and there it was, the first real guess, not a question, a statement trying to sound certain, but missing something underneath. "When?" I let out a quiet breath, glancing up at the sky, clear, wide, uninterrupted, the kind of sky that makes everything feel smaller than it really is. "That is the interesting part," I said. "I did not move them after anything happened, I moved them before." And that was the truth she was not ready for, not because it was complicated, but because it meant I had seen something coming before she believed I ever could. I reached my truck, opened the door, but did not get in yet, just rested my hand on the frame, letting the moment stretch a little longer. "You are lying," she said, quicker this time, sharper, like she was trying to pull control back with force instead of precision. "There is no way you would have done that without telling me." I nodded slightly, even though she could not see it, because that part made sense. That was exactly what she believed, that I would always explain, always include her, always operate in the open, because that was the version of me she had gotten used to, the one who trusted without checking, the one who answered questions without asking why they were being asked in the first place. "You are right," I said calmly. "I did not tell you." And I could feel the shift on the other end, subtle, but real, like a door closing somewhere she could not reach. "Because the moment I realized you were counting my life like numbers on a page, I stopped treating you like someone who needed to know everything." That line landed differently, I could tell. Not because she responded right away, but because she did not, and Olivia was not the kind of person who stayed quiet unless she had to. I slid into the driver's seat, closed the door, but did not start the engine, the interior still warm from sitting under the sun, the faint smell of leather and dust grounding me in something real, something simple. "You are overreacting," she said finally, her voice trying to soften again, trying to reset. "This is just a precaution, my lawyer suggested it, it does not mean anything." I leaned back in the seat, letting my head rest against the headrest, staring straight ahead. "It means exactly what it looks like," I said. "You tried to lock me out before I even knew there was a door." And that was the difference between us now. She was still playing the move she thought would corner me, and I was already standing somewhere else entirely, outside of the board she was trying to control. Daniel, listen to me, she said, more urgent now. We can fix this, we just need to talk through it. I closed my eyes for a second, not out of frustration, but clarity, because this was the part where people usually step back, try to salvage, try to negotiate something that has already been decided in silence long before the conversation begins. No, I said quietly, opening my eyes again. We do not fix something that was planned. And I let that sit there, not as an accusation, but as a fact, something solid, something that did not need emotion to make it real. Then what are you saying? She asked, and this time there was no control left in her voice, just uncertainty. And that was when I finally started the engine, the low rumble filling the space between us, steady, unshaken. I am saying, I replied, my tone unchanged. You tried to freeze something that no longer exists the way you think it does, and now you are going to find out what that really means. I drove out of the parking lot without rushing, merging into the afternoon traffic like nothing had changed, like my life had not just split into two separate timelines, one where I kept trusting and one where I stopped, and as the road stretched out ahead of me, I let the silence settle because that is where the truth usually sits, not in the arguments, not in the loud moments, but in the quiet spaces where everything starts to line up whether you want it to or not, and the truth was I had seen this coming long before today, just not in a single moment, not in a dramatic reveal, but in small details that did not belong together until they did. Olivia had always been ambitious, that was never the problem. I respected ambition, I built my entire life on it. Long hours, early mornings, risks most people would not take, turning a small logistics contract into something that carried real weight across multiple states. I knew what it looked like to chase something bigger than yourself. But what I did not recognize at first was when ambition turned into something else, something quieter, something that watched instead of worked. I remember the first time it felt off. We were sitting at the kitchen table late one night, just the two of us, the house quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator, and she asked me a question that did not sound like a question at all. If something ever happened, how fast could someone access everything? She said it casually, like it was part of a conversation about estate planning or long-term security, and I answered the way I always did. Back then, openly, without hesitation, explaining structures, timelines, how accounts were connected, how everything was designed to be efficient, to be simple, to be transparent, because that is what you do when you believe you are building a life with someone. You do not hide the blueprint, you hand it over, and I did, piece by piece, without realizing she was not asking to understand, she was asking to map. After that, the questions became more specific, not more frequent, just sharper, like someone refining a plan instead of exploring an idea. What about the business accounts? Are those separate? How are the properties titled? If someone challenged ownership, how would that play out? Each question came wrapped in curiosity, in concern, in the language of partnership, but the pattern was there, and I started to feel it before I could explain it, the way you feel a storm before you see it, something in the air that does not belong to the day you are standing in. I did not confront her, not because I was afraid, but because I was not certain yet, and certainty matters when you decide to change something that cannot be undone, so I did what I have always done when something does not add up. I stepped back and watched. I paid attention to timing, to tone, to what was said and what was not, and what I saw was not a single betrayal. It was a shift, slow, deliberate, like a line being redrawn while I was still standing on the old side of it. The night it became clear was not dramatic. There was no argument, no raised voices, just a quiet evening where she thought I was not paying attention. Her phone lighting up on the counter, a message preview that disappeared too quickly for someone who had nothing to hide, and then later, when she stepped out to take a call she said was from a friend, I heard a different tone in her voice, lower, more focused, not emotional, not personal, but strategic, words like documentation, timing, sequence, words that do not belong in casual conversation, and that was when something inside me went still, not broken, not angry, just clear. Because clarity does not shout, it settles, and in that moment I realized I was no longer in the same version of the relationship she was operating in. She had already moved into something else, something structured, something planned, and if I stayed where I was, I would be reacting to decisions she had already made long before I even knew there were decisions to respond to. So I did not react, I did not accuse, I did not ask questions that would only make her adjust her timing. I went quiet, not on the surface. I still showed up, still talked, still sat across from her at dinner like everything was normal, but underneath, I started making changes, small at first, then more deliberate. I reviewed every account, every title, every structure I had set up over the years, not with panic, but with precision. I talked to someone I trusted, someone who did not ask emotional questions, someone who looked at numbers and ownership and risk without bias. And together we rebuilt the foundation she thought she understood, not by hiding it, but by moving it, restructuring it into something she could not reach simply because she expected it to still be where she left it. It took weeks, not days, careful steps, legal, clean, invisible from the outside, because the goal was never to surprise her, it was to remove the assumption she was building her plan on, and by the time she made her move this morning, by the time she filed whatever paperwork she believed would lock everything in place, I was already standing somewhere else, looking back at a structure that no longer had my name on it, and the only thing I felt driving down that road now was not anger, not even satisfaction. Just a quiet understanding that she had finally acted on a plan I had already stepped out of before she even realized I knew it existed. I did not go home right away, not because I was avoiding anything, but because I wanted to sit with the clarity a little longer before stepping back into a place that used to feel predictable. I took the long way through the city, past the warehouse district where my first contract started, past the office building that once felt like the biggest milestone of my life, and it reminded me how everything I built was never about luck. It was about structure, decisions, timing, knowing when to move and when to stay still, and that is exactly what Olivia underestimated. She thought this was about money sitting in accounts, but it was never that simple. It was about who controlled the structure behind it, and I had already changed that. When I finally pulled into the driveway, the house looked the same as it always did, clean lines, trimmed lawn, nothing out of place. The kind of place people assume holds stability just by looking at it. I sat in the truck for a moment, engine off, hands resting on the wheel, noticing how quiet everything felt, like the house itself did not know what had shifted yet. I stepped out, walked to the front door, and unlocked it without hesitation, because this was still my home, at least for now. Inside, everything was exactly where it should be, the same furniture, the same framed photos on the wall, the same soft lighting in the living room, but something about it felt different, not broken. Just distant, like I was walking through a version of my life that had already ended without anyone announcing it. Olivia was standing in the kitchen when I walked in, her back to me at first, hands resting on the counter, and I could tell from the way she held herself that she had been waiting, not pacing, not anxious, just still, controlled. When she turned around, her expression was composed, almost calm, but there was something underneath it now, something tighter, something that had not been there before. "We need to clear this up," she said, her voice even, measured, like she had already decided how this conversation was supposed to go. I set my keys down on the table, taking my time, not rushing to respond. Because urgency is what gives the other person control, and I was not giving that away. "You already tried," I replied calmly, meeting her eyes without raising my voice. "That filing this morning was pretty clear." She exhaled slowly, stepping slightly closer, not aggressive, just deliberate. "It was a precaution," she said again, repeating the word like it would change its meaning the second time. "My lawyer advised it based on what could happen, not what has happened." I nodded once, not because I agreed, but because I understood exactly what she was trying to do, reshape the narrative into something less intentional, less planned. "Precautions do not happen without preparation," I said, my tone steady. "And preparation takes time." Her eyes flickered for a brief second, not enough for someone who was not looking, but I was, and that was the difference now. I was paying attention to everything she thought she could hide in plain sight. "You are reading too much into this," she said, shifting slightly, trying to regain the upper ground. "This is just how these things are handled." I leaned back against the edge of the table, arms relaxed at my sides, no tension, no need to prove anything. Then you should have handled it more carefully, I replied, and that was when the conversation changed, not dramatically, just subtly, like a current shifting direction under the surface. What does that mean? She asked, and there it was again, that uncertainty she was trying to keep buried. I held her gaze, not confrontational, just direct. It means you built your plan on an assumption, I said, letting the words land without pushing them. You assumed everything was still where you left. She shook her head slightly, a small movement but firm. Because it was, she said, more confident now, clinging to what she believed was still true. You cannot just move assets like that without consequences. I almost smiled again, not out of mockery, but because she was still thinking in terms of reaction, not intention. You are right, I said. You cannot move them like that after something happens. I paused for just a second, not long, just enough to let the distinction form. But you can before. The silence that followed was different this time, heavier, filled with realization instead of resistance. She stepped back slightly, not dramatically, just enough to create space, like she needed it to process what she was hearing. When? She asked, quieter now, and that question mattered more than anything she had said so far, because it meant she understood there was something she had missed, something outside the timeline she thought she controlled. I straightened slightly. Not to dominate the space, but because the answer did not require force, just clarity. Before you ever filed anything, I said. Before you ever talked to your lawyer about freezing accounts. Her lips parted slightly, not in shock, but in calculation, trying to reconstruct the timeline in her head, trying to figure out where she lost control of it. That is not possible, she said, but the certainty was gone now, replaced with something else, doubt. I picked up my keys again, turning them slowly in my hand, the small metallic sound cutting through the quiet room. It is, I replied. You just did not see it happen. And that was the moment everything shifted fully, not because I raised my voice or pushed harder, but because the version of the situation she believed in no longer existed, and she was just starting to realize she had built her move on something that was already gone. She did not respond right away, and that silence told me more than anything she could have said, because Olivia was never someone who paused unless she had to. She was the kind of person who filled space with control, with words, with direction, but now she was standing there in the middle of the kitchen, trying to rebuild a situation that had already shifted beyond her reach. Show me, she said finally, her voice quieter but sharper, like she was narrowing her focus instead of losing it. If you are so confident, then show me what you think you did. I tilted my head slightly, not dismissing her, just measuring the request, because this was the part where most people make a mistake. They rush to prove something, they reveal more than they need to, they react instead of letting the other person sit with uncertainty, and uncertainty was doing more work here than anything I could say. You already saw the result, I replied calmly. Your filing did not hit anything. She stepped closer now, a little faster than before, not aggressive, but more direct. That does not mean anything, she said. It could just be delayed. It could take time for the system to process. I nodded once, acknowledging the logic without agreeing with it. That is true, I said. If the structure was still the same. And that word again, structure, I could see it land differently this time, because she understood it. She had spent enough time asking the right questions to know exactly what it meant, and now she was realizing she did not have the answers anymore. You changed ownership, she said slowly, almost to herself, like she was piecing it together in real time. But you would need documentation, approvals, there would be a trail. I let out a small breath, not tired, just steady. There is always a trail, I said. The difference is who it leads to. That was the part she had not considered, not fully, because she had been focused on access, on control, on immediate leverage, not on what happens when the foundation itself moves. She crossed her arms slightly, a subtle shift, protective, thinking, recalculating. You are telling me you moved everything without me knowing, she said, and there was something else in her voice now, not just doubt, but something closer to disbelief, not because it was impossible, but because it meant she had missed it, and that mattered more than the move itself. Not everything, I replied, keeping my tone even. Just the parts you were planning to touch. And that was when her eyes changed, just slightly, a flicker of something sharper, because now she understood this was not random, this was targeted, intentional. How long? She asked, and that question carried more weight than the others, because it was not about what I did, it was about when I started doing it. I looked at her for a moment, not avoiding the answer, just letting it settle before I gave it. Long enough, I said, to know this was coming. She shook her head again. But slower this time, like she was trying to reject the conclusion without fully believing it herself. You are guessing, she said. You saw a few things and you panicked. I did not interrupt her, I let her finish, because people reveal more when they are trying to defend something. You built a story in your head and now you are acting like it is real, she added, her voice gaining a little strength, like she was stepping back into familiar ground, but I stayed where I was, steady, unchanged. If that were true, I said quietly, you would not be asking how long. And that stopped her, not completely, but enough, because it pointed out the one thing she could not ignore. She was not arguing facts, she was trying to recover from them. I walked past her toward the living room, not to leave, just to shift the space, to show that I was not locked into this confrontation the way she expected me to be, and she followed a step behind, not close, but not distant either, like she did not want to lose the position she still believed she could regain. You think this puts you ahead, she said, her tone steadier again, but there was tension underneath it now, something tighter. But you cannot just remove yourself from everything. There are legal implications, there are consequences. I turned slightly, facing her again, the light from the window cutting across the room, casting everything in sharp lines, clear edges, nothing hidden. There are always consequences, I said. The question is who they apply to. And that was the shift she was not ready for, because until now she had been thinking in terms of control, of what she could take, what she could freeze, what she could claim, but she had not considered what happens when the person she is trying to control steps outside of that system entirely. Daniel, she said, and this time my name sounded different, not soft, not controlled, just uncertain. What did you actually do? And I looked at her, not with anger, not with satisfaction, just clarity, because the answer was simple, even if the process behind it was not. I stopped giving you access to something you were already planning to take, I said, and the room went quiet again. But this time it was not just silence, it was realization settling into place, slow, heavy, unavoidable, and I could see it in her eyes. The exact moment she understood that whatever move she thought she made this morning had already been answered long before she ever filed a single document. She stood there like she was trying to hold two versions of reality at the same time, one where everything was still under her control and one where it clearly was not, and I could see the exact moment those two versions stopped aligning, not in a dramatic reaction, not in raised voices or sudden movement, but in the way her posture shifted just slightly, like the ground beneath her had changed shape without warning. You are saying all of this like it is final, she said, her tone quieter now. Less certain, but still searching for something to anchor to. Like there is nothing left to discuss. I walked toward the window, glancing out at the street, cars passing, people going about their day, completely unaware of the conversation happening inside this house, and that contrast always struck me. How something that feels like everything to you is invisible to the rest of the world. There is always something to discuss, I said calmly. Just not what you think. She took a step closer. Slower this time, more careful. Then explain it to me, she said, and there was something different in her voice now, not control, not confidence, but a kind of urgency she was trying to keep contained. Explain how you moved assets like that without triggering anything. Without me seeing it, without anyone notifying me. I turned slightly, resting my hand against the back of the chair, not needing to sit, just grounding the moment. Because you were looking in the wrong place, I said, and that was the truth she had not considered, not fully, because she had been focused on visibility, on access, on the systems she believed she understood. Everything you were watching was designed to look the same, I continued. Same accounts, same balances, same patterns, nothing that would raise a question. Her eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger, but in focus. That is not possible without manipulation, she said, and there was a hint of accusation there, like she was reaching for something she could challenge, something she could push back against. It is possible with structure, I replied, keeping my tone even. You do not move the front, you move what the front connects to. And that was the distinction that mattered, not the visible layer, but the ownership behind it, the part most people never think about until it changes. She crossed her arms again, but this time it was not defensive, it was analytical, like she was trying to reconstruct the system in her head piece by piece. You created a separate entity, she said slowly, more to herself than to me. Transferred ownership through that, and left the interface untouched. I gave a small nod, not confirming everything, but enough, because she was close. Something like that, I said, and that was when the realization deepened, not just that I had moved things, but how I had done it, quietly. Legally, without disrupting the surface she had been watching so carefully. And you did all of this because you thought I was planning something, she said, lifting her gaze back to me, and now there was something else there, not just doubt or calculation, but something closer to frustration, because in her mind, this was still about whether her plan had been justified or not. I did not respond immediately, not because I did not have an answer, but because the answer mattered in how it was said, not just what it was. I did not think, I said finally, my voice calm, steady. I recognize patterns. And that was the difference, not assumption, not paranoia, just observation over time, patterns you chose to ignore. I added, and that landed harder than anything else, because it shifted the focus from what I did to what she had done, the questions she asked, the timing, the way she approached things when she thought I was not paying attention. She looked away for a brief moment, just a second, but enough to show that part of her knew exactly what I meant. So what now? She asked, and that question carried everything that had not been said yet, not just about money or accounts, but about the structure of everything between us. I straightened slightly, letting the room settle into silence before answering. Now nothing changes for you, I said, and that seemed to catch her off guard more than anything else. Nothing changes? She repeated, almost incredulous. You just said everything is different. I nodded once, because both things could be true at the same time. Everything is different, I said, but not in the way you were planning. She shook her head slightly, trying to push back against the logic. That does not make sense, she said, and I could hear the edge of frustration returning, not loud, but present. It will, I replied, when you realize that the control you thought you had was never tied to what you were trying to freeze. And that was the final piece she needed to understand, not just that she failed to lock something down, but that she had been aiming at the wrong target entirely. The silence that followed was heavier than before, not filled with resistance, but with something settling into place, slow, unavoidable, and I could see it in her expression, the exact moment the situation stopped being something she could adjust and became something she had to face, because for the first time since this started, she was no longer ahead of the timeline, she was reacting to one she did not control. She stayed quiet longer this time, not because she had nothing to say, but because she finally understood that anything she said now would not change what had already been done, and that was new for her, not having control over the direction of a situation, not being the one setting the pace of the conversation. You think you outplayed me, she said. Eventually, her voice lower, more measured, like she was choosing each word carefully now, not to persuade, but to understand where she stood. I shook my head slightly, not dismissing her, just correcting the frame. This was never about playing anything, I said calmly. It was about not being caught in something I did not agree to. She let out a slow breath, looking past me for a second, like she was trying to find a version of this that still worked in her favor. You are acting like I did something extreme, she said, her tone shifting again, softer, almost defensive. Freezing accounts during a separation is standard, it is not some kind of betrayal. I did not interrupt her, because this part mattered, not for the argument, but for what it revealed. People protect themselves, she continued. That is all I was doing. I nodded once, acknowledging the statement without agreeing with the intent behind it. Protection usually happens after something is clear, I replied, my voice steady. Not before. That distinction landed differently, I could see it, because it was not about legality, it was about timing, and timing tells you more about intention than any document ever will. You are twisting it, she said, a little quicker now, like she needed to push back against that idea before it settled. You are making it sound like I was planning something against you. I met her eyes, not confrontational, just direct. You were, I said, and I did not raise my voice. I did not add anything to it, because the weight of the statement did not need help, it was enough on its own. The room went still again, not tense, just quiet in a way that made everything feel sharper, clearer, harder to ignore. She held my gaze for a moment, then looked away, not dramatically, just enough to break the line between us. Even if that were true, she said, her voice lower now, less certain, you still cannot just move everything like that and expect it to stand. I leaned slightly against the wall, arms relaxed, not defensive, not aggressive, just grounded. It is already standing, I said. That is why your move did not land. And that was the part she could not get around, not the theory, not the structure, but the result. She tried, I adjusted, and now we were here, in a space where her plan had no leverage. There will be a review, she said, reaching for something solid, something procedural. My lawyer will request full disclosure, every transfer, every document. You cannot just hide behind a structure. I nodded again, because that part was expected, predictable, part of the system she believed would bring things back into balance. I am not hiding, I replied. Everything is documented, everything is legal, everything is exactly where it is supposed to be. And that was the difference, not secrecy, not avoidance, just a shift in ownership that removed her access without breaking any rules. She frowned slightly, not in confusion, but in frustration, because she was realizing this was not something she could simply undo with a request or a filing. Then why? She asked, and that question was quieter than the others, less defensive, more direct. Why go this far instead of just talking to me? I let that sit for a second, not because I needed time, but because the answer deserved to land without being rushed. Because by the time I realized what was happening, I said, you were already planning the version of the conversation where I was reacting. I paused briefly, not long, just enough to separate the thought. I chose not to be in that version. She stared at me, not angry, not even surprised anymore, just processing, like she was seeing the entire timeline differently now, not from where she stood, but from where I had already moved. So what is this then? She asked, and there was no control left in her voice now, just a question that did not have a prepared answer behind it. I looked around the room for a moment, the same space we had lived in, built routines in, shared plans in, and it felt distant in a way that was hard to explain, not broken, just disconnected from what it used to represent. This is what happens, I said quietly, when one person starts planning an outcome and the other decides not to be part of it. And that was the truth of it, simple, direct, not emotional, just clear. She lowered her gaze slightly, not in defeat, but in recognition, because for the first time since this started, she was not trying to win the moment, she was trying to understand how she lost control of it, and that was not something a single answer could fix, not anymore. The silence did not break all at once, it shifted slowly, like something settling into its final shape, and I could see Olivia trying to hold on to whatever part of the situation still felt familiar, still felt manageable, but that space was getting smaller with every second that passed. You are making this sound like there is nothing left between us, she said, her voice quieter now, not sharp, not defensive, just searching for something that still made sense. I did not answer immediately, not because I did not hear her, but because that question was not about accounts or structures anymore. It was about everything underneath it, everything that led to this point, and answers like that do not need to be rushed. There is always something left, I said finally, my tone calm, steady. Just not what you expected to control. She let out a breath, slower this time, her shoulders lowering just slightly, like the tension she had been holding was starting to give way to something else. Something more real. "You think I was trying to control you?" she said, almost as if she was testing the words out loud, seeing how they sounded once they were spoken. "You were trying to control the outcome," I replied. "That includes me whether you admit it or not." She looked at me again, longer this time, not with calculation, not with strategy, but with something closer to recognition, like she was finally seeing the situation from outside of her own plan. "And you decided to remove yourself from it completely," she said, and there was no accusation in her voice now, just a statement, something she was starting to accept even if she did not like it. I nodded once, not adding anything, because that was exactly what I had done, not out of anger, not out of impulse, but out of clarity. She walked a few steps toward the living room, then stopped, like she did not know where to go next, not physically, but in terms of what came after this. And that was new for her, not having a defined next move. "Do you know what this looks like from my side?" she asked, turning slightly, not fully facing me, but not avoiding me either. I leaned back slightly against the table, letting the distance between us stay where it was. "It looks like you acted before you understood the full picture," I said, and that was the simplest way to put it, not an accusation, not an insult, just a fact. She shook her head faintly, almost like she was disagreeing out of habit more than conviction. "It looks like you do not trust me," she said, and that was the first time the conversation touched something real beyond strategy and structure. I did not react to it immediately, not because it did not matter, but because it mattered differently now. "Trust is not something you say," I replied. "It is something you stop preparing against." And that landed in a way nothing else had so far, because it reframed everything, not as a misunderstanding, but as a shift. That had already happened before today, before the filing, before the phone call. She stayed quiet after that, not because she did not have a response, but because the response would have to acknowledge something she was not ready to say out loud. The room felt different now, not tense, not heavy, just clear, like all the noise had been stripped away and what was left was the reality either of us could avoid. "So what happens next?" she asked eventually, and this time there was no edge in her voice, no strategy behind the question, just a simple need for direction. I looked around the room again, the same space that had once felt like a shared plan, and now felt like a point of separation, and I realized that was the answer, not something dramatic, not something immediate, just a change in direction that had already begun. "Next," I said, my voice steady. "Everything moves forward exactly the way it was already set in motion." She turned fully toward me now, her expression searching. "And where does that leave me?" she asked, and that question was not about accounts or legal positions anymore. It was about something much simpler, something more personal. I met her gaze, not cold, not distant, just clear. "Exactly where you placed yourself when you decided to act first," I said, and I did not add anything else, because there was nothing else to add. The meaning was already there, complete. She held my gaze for a moment longer, then looked away again, slower this time, not out of avoidance, but out of understanding, and that was the moment everything settled fully, not with a reaction, not with an argument, but with a quiet realization that the version of control she thought she had was gone, and it was not coming back, not because I took something from her, but because I stepped outside of what she was trying to take in the first place. The room stayed quiet after that, not empty, not tense, just settled in a way that felt final without needing to say it out loud, and for the first time since all of this started, either of us tried to fill that silence with something unnecessary. Olivia stood there for a moment longer, then slowly walked to the counter, resting her hands against it like she needed something solid, something familiar. Something that had not changed even though everything else had. "So that is it," she said. Not asking, not accusing, just stating what had already become obvious. I did not move right away. I let the moment sit because endings are not always loud, sometimes they arrive quietly, in the absence of anything left to argue about. "That depends on what you thought this was," I replied calmly, my voice steady, not cold, not distant, just clear. She let out a small breath, almost a quiet laugh, but without humor, more like recognition. I thought I was securing my position, she said, looking down at the counter, her reflection faint in the polished surface. I thought I was staying ahead of something I could not control. I nodded slightly, because that part made sense, even if the way she handled it did not. And now? I asked, not pushing, just opening the space for her to finish the thought. She shook her head faintly, slower this time, like she was letting go of something she had been holding onto for too long. Now I realize I was trying to control something that had already changed, she said, and there was no defense in her voice anymore, no strategy, just acceptance. I took a step forward, not closing the distance completely, just enough to show that I was still part of this moment, even if I was no longer part of the outcome she had planned. You were trying to control the version of me that stayed the same, I said. The one that did not see it coming. She glanced up at me briefly, then back down again. And you are not that version anymore, she said quietly, and I could hear it, not regret. Not quite, but something close to understanding. No, I replied. I am not. The silence returned again, but it felt different now, not heavy, not uncertain, just complete, like everything that needed to be said had already been said. Olivia straightened slightly, her posture more composed again, but not in the same way as before, not controlled, just steady. There will still be a process, she said, her voice calm, professional again, but without the edge it had earlier. Lawyers, disclosures, everything that comes with this. I nodded once, because that part was expected, not something to resist, just something to move through. There always is, I said, and that was the truth. This did not end in this room, it just shifted direction. She turned toward the hallway, then paused, like there was one more thing she needed to say, not to change anything, just to acknowledge it. You did not fight me, she said, looking over her shoulder slightly. You just stepped out of reach. I met her gaze, not correcting her, not adding anything, because that was exactly what happened, and it did not need to be explained further. That is harder to deal with, she added quietly, and then she walked away, not quickly, not slowly, just moving forward into whatever came next. I stood there for a moment after she disappeared down the hallway, the house quiet again, the same walls, the same space, but none of it holding the same meaning it used to, and that was the real shift. Not the accounts, not the structure, but the understanding that control is not something you take back once it is gone, it is something you stop needing in the first place. I picked up my keys from the table again, turning them in my hand, the small metallic sound cutting through the silence one last time, and as I walked toward the door, I realized something simple, something that had been there from the beginning but only made sense now. You cannot freeze something that no longer belongs to the place you are trying to control, and once you understand that, there is nothing left to fight over. Only a path forward that no longer includes the assumptions that led you here in the first place.